Again and again, each fresh start in Gundam seems to turn into a countdown to the next war. Mobile Suit Gundam reset the count to Universal Century in 1979, Gundam Seed restarted it in 2002, and Iron-Blooded Orphans zeroed it out again, handing control to teenage mercenaries just trying to make rent. That's why today I'm breaking down all 8 of Gundam's major timelines and what each one is actually running from, starting with the timeline that became the template nearly all the others built from. Universal Century. Bandai's own kit catalog lists more than 900 Universal Century mobile suits released since 1980, and that number keeps growing. That's the strange part about how this franchise started. Humanity finally gets off the planet, builds giant rotating colonies in space, and the first administrative act anyone bothers to record is throwing out the calendar. Year 0. Start counting again. Millions of people end up living inside cylinders parked out past the moon, and the paperwork insists they're starting history over from scratch. Spoiler? It doesn't. It reads like a promise. Whatever went wrong on Earth, we're leaving it stamped on the old dates. Mobile Suit Gundam premiered on April 7, 1979, and it's set in Universal Century 0079. That's the number the whole reset produces. 79 years into humanity's clean page, and the thing the new calendar becomes famous for is a war between the Earth Federation and the Principality of Zeon. A colony that left its old problems behind manages to reinvent them inside 8 decades. A detail nobody put in the press release when they zeroed out the years. Somewhere in the middle of that mess is a teenager who never asked to be there, dropped into the cockpit of a prototype nobody had finished testing because his neighborhood turned into a battlefield overnight. Keep him in mind. Nearly every timeline coming after this one hands a similar rough deal to somebody just as young, usually with worse pay and fewer people bothering to write their name down. Details on that particular war get their own dedicated stretch later because there's a lot to unpack. What matters right now is scale. Universal Century is the continuity that decades of sequels, side manga, spin-off games, and one-off OVAs kept building onto generation after generation, without ever needing to reset the clock a second time. No other timeline in the franchise comes close to that kind of accumulated weight. That volume alone puts distance between it and the 7 timelines still to come. Many fans treat it as the main event because the math is lopsided. The longest run, the deepest catalog, the most callbacks. Everything else in Gundam eventually gets filed under the other timelines, a separate shelf next to the one Universal Century built for itself one series at a time, brick by brick, for over 40 years. 15 years after that first reset, somebody starts the count over again and keeps the giant machines while throwing the war itself in the bin. What they put in its place remains one of the most divisive decisions in the franchise. Future Century. Somewhere in the mid-90s, Sunrise looked at its franchise of grim military tragedy and decided the next thing Gundam needed was a fighting tournament. Space colonies representing nations send giant robots to punch other giant robots, and whoever wins the bracket governs the space colonies for the next 4 years. Global foreign policy, settled in a ring. This is a real political system a society agreed to use. The year is Future Century, and it belongs to Mobile Fighter G Gundam, which aired in 1994. Nations field custom Gundams as official state representatives, and the outcome of their duels is legally binding foreign policy. Mexico's entry is a sombrero-wearing luchador. America's is called the Gundam Maxter, and fights like a football player. The creative decisions were made by adults with professional degrees. What makes this interesting, past the spectacle, is the system's underlying logic. The tournament exists because the alternative is a world war fought across space colonies and Earth simultaneously. So at some point in Future Century's history, someone sat down and said, let's compress this. One sanctioned conflict per 4-year cycle. All the violence concentrated into a single bracket, with a lease on global authority handed to whoever survives it. That is a more rational arrangement than most of what Universal Century produced, where 15 years of calendar resets kept handing teenagers the same untested machine in the middle of the same war. Future Century, at least, has a referee. The pivot is sharp enough that G Gundam locked in its reputation early. The weird one. The entry that broke from UC's military drama to do something closer to a shounen fighting series. Follow the fan timeline discussions long enough, and a consistent pattern emerges. G Gundam sits at the top of the alternate continuity list, treated as the first hard break from the original timeline. The placement repeats consistently enough across communities that calling it consensus would be accurate. The unserious reputation has always had pushback, and while that argument sits closer to fan reading than production record, it lands. Plenty of people argue that underneath the luchador robots and national stereotypes is one of the more emotionally raw entries in the franchise, a show where someone fights for something they cannot afford to lose and pays for it completely. Sit with the series rather than its reputation, and that case becomes hard to dismiss. A year later, someone resets the calendar again, drops the tournament entirely, and rebuilds something grimmer, colder, and considerably more familiar from the wreckage. Outside Japan, for a whole generation, that stripped-down version becomes the one that defines the word Gundam entirely. After Colony. For many viewers, this is the one that mattered first. Gundam Wing premiered in 1995, set in the After Colony timeline, and became the series that broke Gundam into the North American mainstream. Western audiences caught it, bought in hard, and for a large segment of the international fandom, AC was the entry point and the primary definition of what Gundam was. The Universal Century, the One-Year War, Amuro Ray in a cockpit his father built, all of that came later, if it came at all. The setup is familiar in a way that turns out to matter. Earth governs the space colonies. The colonies push back. 5 pilots are handed 5 of the most dangerous mobile suits ever built and sent to resolve the tension however the mission demands. The political layer is dense, and the 5 Gundams at the center of it, Wing, Death Scythe, Heavy Arms, Sandrock, Shenlong, are among the most instantly recognizable mobile suits in Gundam. Pull back and look at what AC actually built. Future Century found a pressure valve. Colonies settled disputes through champions, and the war stayed theoretical for one full continuity. After Colony walks straight back through the door, UC opened in 0079. Earth on one side, the colonies on the other, a generation of teenagers handed weapons they barely understand and asked to settle something their parents constructed. The 5 pilots are 15 years old, all 5 of them, which is certainly a choice somebody made. They operate without conventional military backing, behind enemy lines, carrying moral weight that tends to break adults. The franchise keeps returning to this configuration because the cleanest way to make a war personal is to give the most dangerous machine in the room to someone who hasn't finished growing yet. Arguably, where Wing earned its international passport is structural. The conflict AC reconstructs is UC's foundational argument, and audiences could read Earth against the colonies even with zero context for Zeon or the One-Year War. The new calendar counted away from the same original wound, and that familiarity may be what helped it travel. Whether Wing works best as political drama, character study, or action series carried by iconic mobile suit design is a debate that has run for decades. Nothing in the show closes it cleanly. The case for all 3 holds up well enough that the argument remains unsettled. The escape hatch Future Century built closed here. After Colony reproduced UC's fault line and helped sell Gundam to the planet in the same move. The calendar that follows this one skips the argument entirely. It opens on a world where the argument already finished, and someone is walking through what it left behind. After War. Most 1990s Gundam calendars start from a founding or a launch. After War puts the war in the title and dares you to ask what came before minute 1. After War Gundam X aired in 1996, and the name gives away where the clock starts. Universal Century counts forward from a founding. After Colony counts forward from the first space colony's completion. After War counts forward from a collapse, and it says so on the label instead of hiding it in a footnote. By the time the story opens, civilization has already absorbed that damage. Population centers are scattered, the old infrastructure is gone, and the mobile suits still standing are salvage, dragged out of wreckage and kept alive with whatever parts survived the war that named the era. The drama runs on scavenging, rebuilding, and living with the damage a finished war left behind. That ruined world texture is the whole appeal. Viewers who stick with Gundam X often say this is the Gundam that feels like the fighting already happened somewhere off-screen, years before the opening episode, and everybody left alive is just working out how to survive what's left of the map. It is chronologically one of the last alternate timelines the decade produced, arriving as the 1990s wave of new calendars was already winding down. Somewhere in that wreckage, it is still a teenager climbing into a cockpit, same as it always is in this franchise. Teenager, cockpit, no manual. Except the machine underneath them is salvage first, and a weapon second. Fans keep reaching for the same word when they talk about this one. underrated. Many viewers discovering Gundam X years after 1996 found it through late word of mouth rather than the original broadcast, and that late discovery still shows up often in fan discussion. A continuity that opens on the ashes of a war nobody bothered to romanticize earns its reputation slowly, one late discovery at a time, and some fans call it the best-kept secret in the franchise once they finally get to it. After Colony is often read as replaying the same war under a new name, cycling through the same conflict with a fresh coat of paint on the calendar. After War skips that step entirely and opens with the collapse already finished, the wreckage already cooling, which means the calendar has stopped pretending to offer a clean page and started measuring distance from a catastrophe instead. A late 90s reset leans harder into naming the catastrophe than anything else from the same wave. Some fans read the name as quietly grading every calendar before it, and that reading still invites the argument about what the name is actually claiming. Correct century. Most other Gundam calendars describe a circumstance. Universal Century marks the migration off Earth. Future Century is the era of G Gundam's Marshall Gundam fight. After Colony counts the years since space colonization, the world of Gundam Wing. After War dates from the end of a catastrophic space war, the world of Gundam X. Then in 1999, the franchise named a timeline correct century, and fans still hear a verdict in that title aimed at all the rest. The word correct is doing a lot of work. In Japanese, the name is also a pun on Seireki, the term for the Western calendar, but the English title still reads like a calendar grading its own homework, which is either the most confident naming decision in the franchise or the most arrogant one, possibly both, which tracks for a franchise that named one of its wars 1 year while it was still happening. Turn a Gundam aired in 1999, positioned after the main wave of alternate universe experiments that had defined the decade, and it went somewhere few others had tried. The setting is the far future, pastoral and strange, all rolling hills and quiet towns and technology so old it has passed into folklore. Mobile suits get dug out of fields. Wars that defined entire eras of human history exist in this setting as fragments that people try to interpret rather than events that anyone lived through. That is the structural move the series is making. Fans read After War's year count itself as a record of what that war cost. And Correct Century, on that same reading, goes further, turning the act of naming into a claim about which history counts as real. Earlier series often handed a teenager a machine and told him the war was his problem now. The pilots of Correct Century inherit the same arrangement, but their suit is a relic and the war behind it has been underground so long that no complete living briefing of the old wars remains. Muro Ray at least knew which specific disaster put him in that cockpit. The Correct Century pilots are working from ruins and guesswork. The fan debate about where Turn a Gundam actually sits in the franchise chronology is one the series deliberately invites without resolving, and that matters. Nothing in canon draws an explicit line. The far future framing, the archaeological treatment of mobile suit history, the name itself, all of it points toward a reading where Correct Century is the terminal point that every other calendar eventually flowed into, the era that arrived after all of them burned out. That reading makes sense given the evidence. The series keeps the specific relationship vague by design, and the canonical support for any hard chronological claim is thin enough to call it an open question rather than a settled one. 3 years later, the next major calendar aimed at a new generation and rebuilt the founding conflict almost beat for beat, with a brand new reason for two kinds of human being to regard each other as the enemy. Cosmic Era. Gundam Seed opens in the year 2002 and is widely read as restaging the war that built the entire franchise, just with the fault line moved from nationality into DNA. Correct Century, on one common reading, already turns the act of naming an era into a verdict on history. Read that way, Cosmic Era pushes further, using its own fresh start to hand the same founding fight to viewers who hadn't lived through the original war. That's the trick. A brand new calendar, Cosmic Era, functions for many viewers as a fresh calendar remount of the founding standoff Amuro Ray lived through decades earlier, this time drawn through genetics instead of geography. The line runs between coordinators, genetically engineered humans built for enhanced ability, and naturals who never got the upgrade. Here, prejudice runs on genome instead of geography, on what was done to your DNA before you were born, and both sides can call themselves the real humans and mean it. Efficient bigotry, really. Cosmic Era exists on its own calendar, its own colonies, its own war, Entirely separate from the Universal Century, Kira Yamato is a coordinator pulled into an untested mobile suit because his colony becomes a battlefield. A teenager handed a machine built for a fight he didn't start, the same setup that put a scared kid in a Gundam cockpit at the start of the franchise. A setup the franchise has returned to repeatedly. It really does love that plot. Seed became one of the biggest commercial successes in Gundam's history, a major early 2000s gateway title for many new viewers. Fans have spent years arguing about what that introduction actually was. Some read Seed as its own story with its own politics. One heavily argued reading treats it as a remake in disguise. 2 genetically coded populations, a colony drop, a war crime that radicalizes a protagonist, a super weapon debate that splits the cast down ideological lines, line that beats up next to the original war, and they rhyme hard enough that, for a lot of fans, coincidence stops feeling like a serious explanation. On this reading, Cosmic Era reuses the shape of the first war and rebuilds the argument in a genetics lab, then hands it to a large early 2000s audience that had not grown up on the original broadcast. 5 years later, a different calendar throws out the invention step completely. It borrows the year printed on your phone right now and shoves it 300 years down the road, landing on a war dated in numbers that at least look familiar. Anno Domini. Gundam 00 is the only entry in this franchise that hands you a date you could write on a check. Every other timeline in this video reset the clock. UC, FC, AC, AW, CCC, E, PD. Each one invented a year 0 to mark its distance from something. Anno Domini keeps the calendar you already live in and pushes the story roughly 3 centuries forward. The year on screen is the year you recognize, just further along and considerably worse. That choice makes the setting read more like a forecast than a mythic far future. An international power structure set in an invented far future year reads as myth, cushioned by fictional numerals. The same power structure dated AD 2307, a year you could print on an envelope without it looking strange, reads like a forecast instead. Read that way, Gundam 00 becomes the franchise's most explicitly near-future continuity, partly because of the story it chose to tell, and partly because of the numbers it chose to tell it in. Cosmic Era started a new count from its founding catastrophe, the nuclear war that pushed the UN to adopt the Cosmic Era, so newcomers could read the war right there on the dateline. Read as a pattern, it still ends up reconstructing a familiar template under fresh dates. Anno Domini skips the invented year count entirely, and, on that same reading, arrives at a comparable international power structure anyway. 3 major blocks controlling solar energy distribution, a private armed organization called Celestial Being operating completely outside state authority. Whether that structure plays as geopolitics or as colonial grievance wearing a different coat is a matter of interpretation. The clothes are different, the machinery is different. The architecture underneath is recognizable if you have been watching this franchise for more than one entry. Whether Gundam 00 leans harder into political science fiction or into classic Gundam symbolism is a genuine, unsettled debate. You can read the architecture as political projection, specific enough to double as a working model of resource competition and power consolidation. You can just as easily read the teenage pilots as classic Gundam symbolism, kids handed machines they had no part in designing, fighting wars they had no part in starting, going back to UC 0079. Setsuna, one of them, is a former child soldier whose life was shaped by conflict, still paying for that formation. The setting is global. The calendar is yours. Other major timelines bought distance with invented year counts. Gundam 00 is the argument that the distance was always optional. 8 years later, the newest major era named itself straight from the wreckage, handed the cockpits to boys on short-term contracts working for wages in a bunk, and left the question of who was right feeling almost beside the point. Post-disaster. In Post-Disaster, the Gundam pilot is an employee, Mobile Suit Gundam. Iron-Blooded Orphans premiered in 2015 and built its world around mercenary child soldiers running on contracts and wages. The kids in these cockpits fight for pay, among other reasons, clocking shifts for an organization that takes jobs, and the mobile suits they pilot are equipment in an industrial war economy. Fighting is a career. The giant robot is a tool of the trade. The calendar name does the same work. Most other timelines in this video anchored themselves to something aspirational. A space colonization program, a new cosmic era, a dynasty, a correction. Post-disaster anchored itself to a catastrophe. It dates itself from the wreckage, which means every year in the timeline is a year somebody is still living inside what got left behind. The era carries the cost in its name, and the children running contracts inside it are the ones paying it off. That framing connects directly to the wound this franchise keeps reopening. A teenager in an untested prototype ended up in that cockpit because his home was a target, and the machine happened to be there. And the original Universal Century story built its mythology around the accident. Post-disaster rationalizes that same accident into a labor market. The children in these suits fill a slot in an organizational chart. The war economy around them is a system with a workforce, and they are the workforce. That is a colder accounting than anything the Universal Century offered its pilots, and a more honest one about what it actually costs to keep a giant robot running. The community reading of Iron-Blooded Orphans leans hard toward darker and more ground level than most of what the franchise produced before it, and that reading holds up across fan discussion. The contested ground is the ending. Fans split on whether it lands as tragedy or as the only conclusion the story could have earned, and the evidence for a definitive reading is genuinely thin. Both interpretations circulate widely, and the argument is still active. What the calendar settled from the start is the intention. Post-disaster named its entire era after the wreckage, then filled that era's cockpits with children on payroll. Earlier timelines often hid that logic somewhere in the fine print. This one put it in the title. Those year counts were built to get clear of one conflict, and that conflict ran for a shorter stretch than any of the calendars trying to escape it. Its name counts the months, which tells you most of what you need to know about how it went. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.